So, welcome everyone. Welcome to the YouTube audience. As per usual, everyone who's not on team is more than welcome to pipe up at any time. Make your voices heard. That's a specific design goal of those calls, of those dev summits. The one thing, if we have a call for consensus, that's the one time when we ask you, if you're not a team member, to not raise your voice either way, but else you're actively encouraged to raise your voice. To get started, there is one thing which I put in as a priority override, and I didn't see any -1s on it. We need to finalize the Prometheus Conformance program. Of course, CNCF needs it from us so they can do their thing, present it to governing board for approval, blah, 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 blah. As such, everyone is more than welcome to look at the proposal, to look at the PR, which is going to result in this proposal if merged. Of course, if we get consensus on this, we can just forward it to Chris and he can get it merged. Do we need to discuss it, or should we just have a call for consensus?
I have already approved it. My only concern is that 2 Prometheus releases is really like not a long time for many companies. And that would require a lot of involvement from there to keep staying compliant, but that's my only concern. And I'm happy to start like this and see if we get complaints about it.
Yes, that's one of the things where I think it might be possible that we change it over time. But that's a case of trying to, if we take something away, which we used to give, people will complain more than if that's the starting condition and then we find out that it's not workable. From CNCF's point of view, the timelines appear okay. And I know they're quite aggressive by design, but we can also, we can always give more time.
Yeah, and I also think that even within the team, we do not support basically more than the 2 last releases. So I think it's also unfair to ask for, well, to allow more at the moment. So
I think it's a reasonable start.
So it's good for me. I have already approved the PR, so we can do a call for consensus, I think.
That's awesome, I got. Anyone else? Okay, so consensus.
Okay.
Consensus. We approve the Prometheus Conformance program as per commit hash. As per commit ID of the thing which is linked. All agreed? Anyone disagreeing? Very good.
I also note that for the team members who are not there, the pull request is already 3 days old, so lazy consensus applies.
It's in the CNCF, not in the Prometheus repository, so it doesn't have precedent. But I suspected it was uncontroversial anyway, but wanted to make sure that we do have consensus. So next one is going to be fun. Do we have Ben here? No, we don't. Next one is OpenMetrics _created and how to handle it with the amount of metrics which it creates. Julian, put it there.
Yeah, so some of the instrumentation libraries, for example, Java, had the created metrics when you have OpenMetrics enabled, and you cannot disable OpenMetrics, by the way. And we have seen some users for which this is causing high disturbance. I did not understand why they have that and why this is causing so many metrics that they have no usage for in Prometheus. And along the discussions, I know that Julius was even proposing that we just drop them in Prometheus. Of course, there are other concerns, so I wanted to bring the discussion here so we can put an end to that issue and decide what we do with those created metrics.
Yeah, it's something that at least one of our development teams has commented on, and as a result, they haven't switched to the latest version of the Java library because, from their perspective, it's adding huge. I think it's memory that it's adding a huge amount to, and therefore they have huge performance concerns about it.
But are you speaking about issues on the client side or the Prometheus side?
This is on the client side, sorry.
So even the client side have issues with that?
Yeah, because it's from their perspective, it's adding. I think there's a number of different things that it's adding, because there's also possibly exemplar stuff as well that's in a similar sort of version of the library, and so it suddenly they tried it and the resource usage increased dramatically, which they were quite surprised about. And then because there's quite a long issue about it, they were sort of, we're going to hold off and see what's going on rather than continue with it.
I mean, I suppose I can understand the concern. Like, I don't know what the implementation looks like, but I guess it has the potential to double the resource usage, right?
Worst case, yes, depending on implementation.
I mean, we had a similar issue with Python, which had this way earlier, where the first user, I think, who reported was actually one who was scraping via a low bandwidth connection, which is, of course, not the signature use case of Prometheus, but this user was upset that it essentially doubles the throughput for scraping, which is another one where just dropping it on the Prometheus side wouldn't really help. And then it was, back then in the discussion was said, you can just put a relabel rule in there to drop those metrics, to not ingest them, which I guess is good enough if it's actually only a problem on the Prometheus side. But some users have problems somewhere else.
And I did look at the OpenMetrics specification, and the libraries should expose the created, so it's not a must. So we could drop them directly on the client side.
It's a must.
I have seen that as I have read a should.
Yeah, I also read it as a should. If we go double check.
Yeah, I also thought it's a should, but
Wait.
we can check that, right? We have a spec.
Yes, we have
Exactly.
I thought it was a must. So just from my side, Ben is not here, but initially the ask came from Google to allow more. Well, not complex is the wrong word, but basically to allow more resilient rates and such, and detect resets and make predictions about how that thing develops in the future and such. That's where the initial ask was coming from. So it's not the requirement, or the ask is not driven by anyone who is currently part of the OpenMetrics team. With my OpenMetrics hat on, we stated that OpenMetrics intends to follow Prometheus. We do have a backwards compatibility requirement in there, but it's not yet gotten the stamp of approval by ITF, so it's still more malleable than if there was an official RFC. So that as the background from OpenMetrics side. My own stance, it makes sense, but on the other hand, if it creates problems where we didn't have problems before, it's something we need to address. Bartek, please say it so it's on the call.
Maybe I don't want this on recording. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I would vote to just keep it simple and just maintain the same behavior of the Prometheus from the Prometheus perspective. So ignore those metrics because they're not useful. What about that? What's harm in this?
I think keeping this same behavior would actually be that the client can turn this off on their end. And I think this is that would be my suggestion and my recommendation to have each client have since it's a should, right? Like maybe we can have it on by default, but allow people to optionally turn it off if this is a problem, just like in this case.
The created timestamp is a should. I just looked it up in the conspec.
Yep.
So
Perfect.
I think it would make most sense to have an option on the instrumentation library because that would also address bandwidth problems, client resource users problem. Plus, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole of how we like this whole. Do we only present it if open metrics is negotiated, and then you have differences in the metrics created on the Prometheus server depending on what you negotiate, which is yet another more complex issue.
To Bartek's point, I think it would make sense to have sample configuration maybe even commented out in the default configuration to show people how to do it with relabeling if they want to do it through relabeling. But I do agree that it makes sense to have it on the client side.
Makes sense, but is it by default on the client side disabled?
Not specified. I already. That's what I just wanted to say for the open metrics side. I think this should be clarified because the current wording is if present, then it must end in _created, and that's not the best of wordings. Because even myself, just doing a quick search, got confused. Talk of the devil.
Well, the wording further up is that a metric with type counter should have a timestamp value called created.
Yes, but if you search for _created,
if you search for under
examples, you see the must, but the must is for if present, which is not the ideal wording. On the other hand, you should not have more than one normative sentence regarding one specific, because if those ever drift, you have a problem.
I also note that in the open metrics example, there should not be metrics with the created suffix other than those ones, but it is not a must. So users can still define their own metrics that end with _created. So if we drop them by default in Prometheus, that would be an issue for those users because it's not a must in open metrics.
That's a fair point.
I think there is a must around you cannot have conflicts. Like you cannot even risk a conflict.
No, exposers should avoid names that could be confused with the suffixes that text format sample metrics names use. We didn't go with must because we cannot know historical stuff. Blah, blah, blah.
Interesting. Yeah, because client Python actually it will fail. It is a hard failure to define things that could conflict, I believe.
Which is fair on the implementation side, because implementers can take a stronger stance than the specification.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not invalid open metrics if you have used the suffix not as a suffix, but it doesn't conflict. That's a different thing. I think it's cool if we have it as an option because also not many in relative terms. It's not that a lot of people complain, and if you just can tell them you can flip that little config switch, I think that would make them already quite happy. While just saying them that's the way it is, go deal with it is not very friendly.
One comment I'd make is that at the moment, because it doesn't do anything, a lot of people will go, well, why is it the default to be on? Why is it there in the first place? So I guess the question is it going to be useful at some point? Because I can see some benefits to it in terms of the idea of resilience and knowing a bit more about it. But obviously at the moment, with it not actually doing anything, it is a completely useless metric to a certain degree.
I mean, my personal vision is that we can finally solve this issue with counters that only spring into existence once they have incremented once.
Yeah.
Brian had a lot of resistance against that, but I still believe there is a way of at least making it work in most cases. But that's the future. It's not what we have right now.
As per the default, maybe we should ask the wider community and look for feedback actively. I'm honestly torn on enabling or disabling underscore created by default. I think for the primary libraries, we should have the same default across everything which we offer. But I don't have a strong opinion on which way we go with the actual setting, as long as it's maximally consistent.
If it's something that we were able to say is going to be used for sorting out counters or something, rates and things in the next reasonably short period of time, then it sounds like a default of yes makes sense, because then it makes everyone's life easier because it's then there for when it is switched on. But if it's we'd like to do this, but it could be 3 years' time, then it feels like the opposite of actually we should have the default of maybe false, because it's generating more traffic and memory usage and all that sort of stuff for no conceivable benefit for quite a period of time.
Well, the thing is that if Prometheus kind of supports that, and if we ingest that still as a second metric, then we could just use process start seconds in most of the time. So we don't actually need for each counter its own timestamp, because we already have one for each exported process.
Yes, but that only works if you like. We are replaying parts of the open metrics discussions, but that only works for counters which are existing at the process start. Which, in particular, if you're dealing with, for example, hardware or with things which have lots of different connections, might not be the.
It's not even the case within Prometheus. Like, you can hot reload things that create new counters or get rid of old counters. Yeah. So is my question, I was going to bring up the exact same point as Stuart. Like, is there appetite for actually using the created value in Prometheus server? Like, is that something we want to do? Because I think that definitely influences whether it should be default on or off for me.
The chicken and egg is, if it's there, it will naturally entice more people to actually play with it. On the other hand, that is not an argument in and as of itself. As such, I think we're back at least trying to ask the wider community what they would prefer, and have a period of, I don't know, maybe a month, where we just try and find feedback, what people would like, and then do our best to apply that thing, at least across all the things which we have, as in client libraries and exporters.
I mean, there is also the inverted chicken egg, right? Where, I mean, if we think why is it there, it's there because certain groups wanted it, and why do those groups want it? They would require it if they adopted open metrics, and I think that was the idea. Open metrics is supposed to be used even outside of the Prometheus ecosystem directly, so that would also be a bit counterproductive if we removed it now effectively, and then people might shy away from adopting it because of that. So it's kind of a bit of a hard thing. I could see it definitely once we have a richer metadata story in Prometheus, which is another not yet written design doc. Then I would totally love to have this created time in there. But right now that doesn't exist yet.
I mean, that doesn't solve the transport and the client memory problem, but it most certainly would solve the Prometheus problem, because you would have one created until it changes.
But I think that we almost have a consensus that we want an option, but that it's better to leave it on for the moment by default.
Yeah, I mean, we just have to decide about the default. That is what I get from the feeling.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe let's write two. I think we could definitely write one consensus that is client libraries should have a way to turn off created. And then we can have that second one for defaults to on or get more community, or there are a couple options there, so I'm not sure we have consensus on that.
Sorry, I was just trying to fight Google Docs. The noises I was making without blocking Julian while typing. Do we just want to say this about client libraries or also our exporters?
They use the client library. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but okay, I'm adding the exporters explicitly because this is relevant for the exporters as signal to the library which is being used.
Yeah, it's both. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, those config options need to be, in a way, what's the word? Propagated from the users through the code that is using the library to the library, right? I mean, that's what in Klein Golang, I was super conservative about those things that would like change something like that. And yeah, at least, I mean, of course, not all users of the library made a config option for their users, but when the users of the users complained, at least they were satisfied by telling them, yes, you can offer this config option because the library allows you to configure it. And that's probably what we have to do.
So let's try this. Our first-party consensus. Our first-party client libraries and exporters should have a parameter to turn off _created. All agreed? Anyone disagreeing? Very good. The next one is currently consensus. The default is to keep emitting the _created. I would tend towards while we get user feedback to add while we get user feedback, that we actively try and get feedback. Because again, this ask initially came from Google. I forgot his name, left Google and also stopped contributing to Open Metrics a few months after. So yeah.
What if we do handle this at least at a protocol level where Prometheus has a easy switch to ignore created at when coming from Open Metrics?
Yes, that's
So
yeah. We already discussed this, but for client memory usage, client-side memory usage reasons and data transmission usage, if you have a small pipe, you also need it on the client side. But having default configuration, which is disabled, but as part of the default configuration is in my head already on the to-do list.
I mean, if we require now that the default is on, we would essentially force Klein Golang into a major release just for that. So if we also require that all the client libraries do the same thing, right? Now, I mean, Bartek has to speak for Klein Golang by now, but
Klein Golang is not 1.0 yet.
Klein Golang is 1.0.
Oh.
1. Well, where are we now? 1.9, 1.11? I don't know.
Let's do it differently. Consensus. We will gather user feedback on which they would prefer as a default.
Yeah. I mean, it could end up with something, if you want to change the default, it needs a major release, or you're still in 0. something. But we should be careful of mandating the same behavior here across all client libraries.
Fair, that's the next point of consensus. But for this one, consensus, we will gather user feedback on which they would prefer as a default. Or on what default they would prefer, on what default. Okay, so I rewrote, so sorry. Consensus, we will gather user feedback on what default they would prefer. All agreed. Anyone disagreeing? Very good. Consensus, we will suggest this default across our ecosystem. And I put in suggest, so as to Björn's point that no one is forced.
Does it mean that we have to wait to find a proper way to gather the user's feedback before we can implement it with the default true?
I would say give it a week or 3, write to the developers and users mailing list, ask on discourse, make a thing on Twitter where people can click, and that's our due diligence, I think. We can also ask on IRC, and maybe Slack, but doing this, we have covered literally all main supported community feedback channels, and then we just give it a week or 3 and done.
I mean, I would be very surprised if that feedback results in a lot of, like, any significant number of people saying they want it on, because there are no use cases with that we are aware of, which shouldn't mean that we should never reconsider that, right? If we later in the future have the power use case for that, we might just reconsider it and then whatever, do something with a major release in libraries that already have a 1.0 release or something. I don't know.
Which is not blocked by us deciding and asking for a preferred value for the default right now and suggesting this default across the ecosystem. If something changes, we will be revisiting this anyway.
Yeah. So, but what I want to say is we probably don't need to discuss more details. Let's just see what comes out, and I expect that the result is users want it default off. And then we default it off for now. And if we ever want to default it on, we will continue the discussion.
I think having a consensus on us suggesting this default across the ecosystem would be nice, because it's signaling way beyond just this call and this group of people. But if we can't find consensus on this, it's also not super urgent. So you're muted, Björn.
I'm also not talking. I'm
okay.
just looking up what the exact formulation of the consensus is.
It is consensus. We will suggest this default across our ecosystem. And using suggest precisely to your point that no one is forced.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if the outcome is default off, it's fine, because the only library that is 1.x has it off. Kind of. It doesn't have it at all at the moment, but it would have it off. While if the outcome is unexpectedly that we should default on, then we have the problem that Python and Java already have it, and they should just keep it then. But we could probably not put it to on without a major release in client Golang. That's kind of what's my concern.
But that's obviously, it is a suggest, so client Golang could go, well, it's too hard, we're not going to do that straight away. So thank you.
Yeah, my point is, let's just not spend more time discussing it. Let's see what the output, I mean, we could say if the output, I mean, but that's kind of a bit weird. If we say, if the result is that the community wants it off, then we suggest it to be default off across our ecosystem. If it's yes, we have to reconsider what we do. That's a bit weird as a consensus.
Are you against finding the consensus? Because then we can just delete it. If you're not actively against it, we can try to go. I'm fine either way. I'm just trying to move on.
My opinion is it depends on the output of the user survey if we suggest the same default across our ecosystem.
Well, I think if the user community suggests one thing, then we should generally listen to them, rather than saying, actually, we know better, we should ignore what everybody thinks because of other reasons.
Yeah, so in the case of client Golang, and this is like the 13th most used Go package. So I think every tiny change we do will have huge repercussions, and we cannot just vote among a limited set of users if we should break the world, right? That's why I think
but again, we've not said you must. We've said the suggestion is.
But if the Prometheus Dev Summit suggests across the ecosystem and then the Prometheus team people themselves don't follow those suggestions, is also a weird message, right? But this is in
the opposite's true as well, though, of if the consensus is that we do it and we do it on all the other client libraries and then client Golang doesn't, you still can't win either way, because the thing that works is if everything's consistent and going in the same direction.
But what I hear from Björn is that you want to gather user feedback and only act if the feedback is what you expect.
I think we should gather the feedback because it's valuable to get an idea. I expect with 99% chance the feedback will be, please switch it off by default. And then in that case, I think we should make it off by default everywhere. But if the output is it should be on by default, I think we should keep it where we already have it on, and we need to reconsider what we do with client Golang. And I think for this 1% of outcome, we don't need to invest time right now to determine what the outcome is.
I have another option. What if Björn and I write a proposal for what Björn and I want, which is off by default, and we gather feedback on this specific proposal for rough consensus, and then we just do, and if the rough consensus says that Björn and my proposal for off by default is okay, then we make that the suggested default. And this way we don't have the matrix of all opinions colliding.
Yeah,
because let's present an opinion and see if we get too much objection or not.
My suggestion is we just stop at, we will get the user feedback on what default would be, and once we have the result, we can continue the discussion. I mean, we have this every month, right? This is not that we, or it might be even if the outcome is it should be default off, we might not even need to discuss it. Here, we just act on it, right? And we don't have to we don't have to do anything more heavyweight than that. Unless the outcome is, yeah, please default on, and then we have to discuss again. But we don't need to do this speculatively.
The thing which I'm mentally stuck on is it feels as if we are basically asking for an opinion we intend to ignore.
No. If the opinion is default on, we just discuss how we implement that. If the opinion is default off, we don't need the discussion. But it's like speculative branch prediction. We just, right now, we act as if the answer will be default off, because that's most likely, and we don't need to spend an hour to discuss what to do if the answer is default on. That's what I'm saying.
You mean that no, client Golang does not have the created matrix?
Sorry, what was that?
Does client Golang have the underscore created matrix? No.
Client Golang doesn't have it yet. And if we introduced it, the plan so far was to introduce it with a configuration switch, right? Where you say, I want created timestamps. And if that's what's the output of the user feedback, no discussion needed, right? If the output is a different way, we have to discuss how to do this. And if we do it, if it's wise to do it, now knowing that the user feedback is that way. But I'm only saying, let's not invest this time for something that is an unlikely outcome anyway. That's the only thing I tried to say.
I agree with that statement. I also think getting feedback is like, yes, it is completely biased to turn them off because Prometheus doesn't do anything with it right now. If someone comes and contributes that we actually do something with underscore created in the next 6 months, that I could imagine that feedback being completely different. So,
and that's also
I don't even know if this user survey and getting feedback is helpful. Like, it somewhat depends on do we want to use created or not in the server.
It's a chance to find out if there are already people using it, right? That would be a very valuable outcome of the feedback. It's also not, I don't see it as a strict vote. It's just find out what the sentiment is. And if like 3 important players step forward and say, yes, we're using this everywhere already, that's an important piece of information.
Okay.
And I would also like that we get your feedback on the open metrics mailing list, not only in Prometheus.
Yeah, okay, so just to try and move on either way, I tried to rewrite again to catch all of this, and if not, we just delete it and move on. Consensus, we intend to suggest this default across our ecosystem, potentially based on a design document. That should address everything Björn said, I think, but if not, then we just delete it and move on.
No, it doesn't address what I said. I'm sorry.
No, fine. It's completely fine. I did it. Is there anything else regarding _created? Of course, then. Okay.
I think, yeah, what we have. Let's gather that feedback, and based on that information, let's continue the discussion. It might be a very simple discussion, then it might be a more complex one, but we will see.
Totally fine. Yep. So next one. There's something weird with Google Docs. Next one is by Björn. Make numbers and duration literals the same.
Okay. Now all those come up.
We are making progress.
So yeah, so I have this fairly brainstormy document that's already linked. That's also linked down there about time in a way. And one idea was that we can unlock a bunch of things by making every number also a duration literal, like a number is just number of seconds. And vice versa, every duration literal could be interpreted as a number, the seconds in that duration. And just in the spirit of we are actually not really strictly typed in PromQL, just do it. Like you could write obfuscated stuff. Like if you want to write the number 100, you could write 1 minute 40 seconds instead, just to win an obfuscation contest. But I think this is, I mean, in a future version of PromQL, we could have a duration type, but we don't really have. I mean, we have that right now, but it causes trouble, right? And that would be a first step to get away from that. That's also you can what's written there, right? You could create stuff that is sub-second, which you can't right now. You can use a duration literal in predict linear instead of just spelling out the number of seconds. You could use something like process start time seconds minus whatever time is greater than 1W instead of spelling out the number of seconds in a week. And it shouldn't break anything. And of course, there's future ideas that at some point you can actually use PromQL expression to determine a duration from other expressions. But that's just a future step. That's just about syntax here for now.
Actually, do you mind elaborating on the future aspect? Are you expecting that a result could be a duration as well?
So that could be, I mean, the most primitive thing. No, there are two very simple things. The one is you just want arithmetic in a duration, right? So in Grafana, that's a long. I mean, we have this. Okay, one step back. We have this magic rate interval in Grafana as a template variable now, which solves 99% of the problems, but not all of them. But many people would have liked to say, okay, I have a value and I want to take 5 times that value. Like I want to write 3 times scrape interval or something, right? And then Grafana templating said, great, but we cannot do arithmetic in our templating engine. Perhaps we will introduce this feature into the Grafana templating engine at some point in the future. On the other hand, we could as well have arithmetic in PromQL. So you could write 3 times whatever numbers, 3 times 3 weeks, 3 times 1 hour, which is in static PromQL seems pretty brain dead, because why aren't you just writing it down? But if you go through templating with a templating engine that doesn't do arithmetic, it suddenly makes a lot of sense, right? So that's the one thing where you would have an expression. Note, this proposal here is not yet that, because it's way more complicated to make expressions work there, because so far the PromQL engine assumes that just by static analysis, essentially, of the expression, it can determine which time frame it has to access in the TSV. And in this case, it needs to do some evaluations, simple arithmetic, but it needs to do evaluations to do that, which leads me to the next step. If you want to put a duration into another time series coming from a recording rule, to just make the duration configurable, right? Like essentially teams can upload recording rules to say what duration they want in their alerts in that rate expression, right? And what we do a lot for thresholds, right? You often put thresholds in the recording rules because that's possible. You use recording rules as constants in a way, right? But you can't do it for durations, because that again needs an evaluation, and that becomes really complicated internally. But at least this would build the groundworks where we could, if we want to in future, do this. But we don't have to do it right now. It already unlocks things.
I mean, I think you already kind of alluded to what the... I like this a lot. I think for that use case, the let's call it dynamic durations. I think I would probably like to see a design doc for that. But other than that, I love this.
So I love the idea of having comparison to durations, and in some places allowing duration in place of scalars, but I have concerns the other way around, like what will happen if someone asks for the rate of +inf, or what happens if someone asks the rate for nan, and also like what happens if someone asks for the rate below the millisecond. So now you can do duration up to the millisecond, and that's what the TSDB supports. But what will happen when people will put 0.000001 in the rate?
We need to define that, right? In that case, I guess you round to the next millisecond value, and if a future TSDB does nanoseconds, because speed traders want to use Prometheus, then it will not round. I mean, we already have that in open metrics, right? Because you can create a time step in open metrics that is 0.000001, and you would round in the same way. I mean, those are valid concerns, but I don't think they are serious concerns.
I think those are the types of concerns which would ideally be addressed in a design document. Should we just have a call for consensus for wanting to have a design document on this that we generally support and want to see a design document?
Sure, makes sense.
Okay.
More to-do slots in our design list.
Should we have a consensus that Björn writes it, or?
I cannot
yes,
commit to this right now.
But he writes it by next week.
Do you think we can override him?
Not next week. Next week is special. I expect great things. Consensus. We like the idea and intend to explore it in a design document. All agreed? Anyone disagreeing? Very good. Next one is Bartek. One push API, push gateway API versus open metrics push versus Prometheus remote write.
Right. So I think this is something what I wanted to touch on for a long time. So there are still some use cases for pushing a metric, right, to your application. Push gateway is one thing. We recently started discussion around serverless and essentially short-living containers. For some cases, the pushing capabilities similar to statsd, which Bjorn mentioned before, is desired. We have some semi-stable things that work, which is like push API. It's part of the client Golang, so it's kind of official. Recently, we introduced Open Metrics, which has push API, which I was not even aware of because there is no example implementation of it. So I guess there is some work to be done if we want to share this wider. And I want to mention that Remote Write is capable of doing this pushing API kind of capabilities because it has metadata, fields from recent kind of extensions, right? So there is huge overlap between those APIs. So my question is like, do we want to maybe reduce at least, I don't know, remove push gateway API and get Open Metrics API as the official one and deprecate the push gateway API, because those are the ones that to me are definitely overlapping. Because if you see the example of push gateway API, it's really like Prometheus exposition format being pushed, right? Remote write is, to me, ideal, end goal, because it can replace push gateway API, it can replace open metric push, and actually have more capabilities for replication because it can group samples under single metadata, under single series. So to me, in ideal world, I would have just remote write, to be honest. I don't see any harm in that. So I would love to see, your feedback. First of all, maybe what to reduce, what to take as an official one, and how to document it better, how to show it better, right?
So my use case for the push gateway API is cron job that just have access to curl. And if you tell me how I can do remote write with curl, I would be happy to do that. And I think that's a lot of the people are just using like cron job in Red Hat Linux when they have access to curl and text file, and they just do a curl and they push the metrics. And that's not possible with remote write.
Yep, I also think remote write is too complicated a protocol, and we just had someone spend an entire week to build an Arduino library for it. But if it's a push gateway API, that would be like 5 lines or something.
Bartek, you're calling it push gateway API, so you're not talking about the push gateway itself, or are you?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm talking about API because it's kind of, we can use this API outside of push gateway itself, right? It just, push mechanism that people sometimes, I think it's used as a good question. What is used in the WeaveWork aggregation proxy, which apparently is used a lot? I think it's push gateway API, if I'm not wrong. This is something I guess we need to check.
I think so.
That's why I separate those things.
I mean, the problem here is also that the name push gateway, we should have never named it push gateway, right? We should have named it export server because that's what Google called it. We just didn't want to copy all the Google names because we were afraid, I don't know. I don't know. I think this was somebody who was not an ex-Googler called it push gateway, and he said we should not just use our internal Google nomenclature everywhere and confuse people. But now we have confused people because people think it's to push metrics, which it's not, right? It's also like if you switched push gateway to be a remote write receiver, you would increase that confusion even more because it's not really a remote write receiver, right? I mean, it wouldn't propagate it properly to Prometheus. Well, on the other hand, if you have a job who uses remote write to push to a Prometheus server, that's a very different thing from pushing to a push gateway. Also, you have to, like in the Prometheus setup, you have to push to all Prometheus servers that are in your HA setup. Well, push gateway is like this one single thing where you push to, and then all the Prometheus servers crave it. I think it's a very different thing, and perhaps it's just a clarification issue.
There is so first, I fully agree. We shouldn't have. We need something simple which you can just write in a shell script or so. And I do think that in theory we can rename the push gateway to something more fitting. Which brings me directly to the next point, which I already pre-wrote in the thing. I do expect that we will have more use cases for things which are inherently pushed and cached by a thing, as in MQTT and such. As like in particular, Zigbee and MQTT are the things within the IoT space, and there's more and more use cases. I mean, the use cases exist for ages, but as more and more industry players, like actually production industry or data centers and such, start using Prometheus, we will have more and more of an issue where we need to have this official landing ground for things. Having a nomenclature in parallel to exporter, like cacher or something, might make sense, where we have the OpenMetrics push caching gateway. Shitty name, but you get my drift, where we have the MQTT caching thingy, that kind of thing. I think that the use case will not go away, and I think the use case for different formats will actually increase, not decrease. On the back end, it can be remote write, no worries. If you have local everything. The other thing which we need to consider is staleness and upness. That's something which, e.g., OpenTelemetry is forced to address for certain scenarios. Of course, you have inherent properties of pull, which push simply cannot have in precisely the same way. You can make approximations, but you cannot make the same guarantees about reachability which you can make with pull.
Okay, so what I gather, it looks like we have this direction of thought that we should, find an official push API, but this has to come with some implementation of distributed counter, distributed gauge, or anything like that, right? And I wonder, I'm here in this maintainer team for like, I don't know, 3 years or something. I still don't get why we cannot extend the push gateway to do this. So I think we need to have some kind of direction on this one. Should we just create something new, or yeah, I'm sorry, I'm ignorant, but like push gateway to me should be capable of doing those things.
What specifically you mean? The push gateway should be able to do Prometheus remote write?
No. To do this distributed counter cache, which we describe as an open metric pusher, right?
In my opinion, this is basically an agent use case. It's like going back, I think, roughly 2 years in our discussions, we had this discussion about a more or less caching Prometheus, which sits in a POP. Like that was the example I used back then, which sits in a POP, and it's like a super short-lived Prometheus, which is able to function on its own and do everything you need it to do, but it's designed to get all its data to somewhere else. Yet, if it loses connection, it's able to retain local state. It can show you. It can even create local alerts and such. And to me, all of those use cases are basically instantiations or sub-use cases of this wider thing. So my thinking is that we approach this from an agent point of view, or from an edge point of view, or POP, or what have you point of view, solve it for this generic case, and then we just break those individual components out again into things which you can run on their own. So I see a combined Prometheus agent, similar to how the Grafana agent has more than one thing, as an absolute possibility. But that design should then match, for example, this new push cache thingy. I mean, just a push gateway shouldn't be able to scrape, but an agent is able to scrape. And if you have a few flags, you can just make that thing act in precisely the way you want it. Does it need to have local storage? Do you want to have a local query? Do you need local recording rules? Do you need local alerting? Do you need it to scrape, or do you expect it to just be pushed to? Do you need it to receive MQTT, or do you expect it to just do open metrics or what have you? This kind of thing. And then you just break it out again into individual components, so you can run everything on its own as per recommended standard.
But aren't we just describing the OpenTelemetry collector? Why would we need to rewrite the OpenTelemetry collector? Because that's what it's doing.
Ish, not quite. The big difference is one has a optimized happy path, and it's optimized just for the one use case, and also completely based or largely based on long-running battle-proven code, whereas the other has a much wider envelope and wants to cover even more use cases and highly complex pipelines, which I don't think should be in scope for a opinionated implementation which is specific towards Prometheus.
But they aim to be Prometheus compatible.
Yes, and I like from the test results and everything, they're working towards this, and they will have it at some point. But I don't think it makes sense to completely give this away, in particular due to us already having all the bits and pieces. Like we do have a local cache that's called TSDB. We do have an interface to the alert manager, which is already compatible with the Prometheus alert manager. All those bits and pieces would make sense. I mean, we made the argument or the proposal to the OpenTelemetry team several times to work together on an agent as the basis for a generic collector, which they can then extend with OTLP and everything, but that never came to be. Yet, I don't think we should be pulling all the things in which are not Prometheus specific for something which we intend to be used in a Prometheus specific manner.
Yeah, and I think the problem with, or like missing part in the OpenTelemetry right now collector is that it doesn't support open metric push, right? So I think that's another missing point. But you know, if we can add that receiver, what they called, right? You know, in theory, it can fit our use case. So I think that's a fair point Julian covered, but they're still missing compatibility, right? Okay. Anyway, I'm not sure if we should focus or like I don't know discuss if such caching capability for pushing things, aggregating things, and you know constructing literally metrics from event, because that's what it is. We should put it inside Prometheus or some separate or some agent or outside, because I don't know, why not just keeping it as a sidecar, as an exporter, and then you know just later on we can discuss if this should be one of the one binary or not. I don't think it's an important detail. We have more unknowns right now. So the question is like, what actionable we can do from here? Looks like we have some rough consensus. Do we have consensus on creating some kind of aggregation exporter for those push cases?
Is that WeWork thing? Has anyone tried this in production? That's the question. I mean, if that's already cool, we could. I mean, we already recommend to try it out if you need this use case, and if that's a good start, we could ask WeWorks if we can put this into the Prometheus org, or if we just need to refine it a bit. It's an Apache license. We can just put it into the Prometheus org as a fork. I mean, there's a paragraph about this aggregation feature in Push Gateway in the Push Gateway README, which is essentially It doesn't say no, that can't be in push gateway, but it's just a different use case. And if we want the push gateway to do those two things, we can do it. But we could as well have it in two different things. That doesn't really make a difference. The concern so far I had is that it needs to be well understood. Like, I'm worried about how do you prevent double counting and loss of counts and all those things. Like, if the pushing client gets a network error, should it retry? Because the retry might be a double count or it might not. And then you need some ID in your push or something. I mean, all those mistakes that's made needs to be thought through, and totally open to do this properly, but somebody has to do it properly, right? We cannot just say it's easy, let's just put it into push gateway. I don't think it's that easy.
Yeah, true.
And yeah, that's why I'm really honestly curious how people have fared with the Weaveworks push aggregator. Perhaps it's all great, right? And then we could just adopt it.
I think it would be a good starting point, but definitely
we can ask the usual suspect who committed the Prom aggregation gateway, which is Brian Bohem and Tom Wilkie.
I think we can reach them. The other person who we can reach is Robert, who joined the call some time ago. Because like what I'm hearing is a little bit Prometheus collector-ish. So I know there's bits and pieces planned for Grafana agent to also be collector-ish. Maybe that's also something which we can reuse for this type of thing.
Yeah, and perhaps you can hit all birds with that stone, right? Also this, when we talked about serverless, if you have a serverless use case where you are willing to push something over the network, you could do it with exactly that thing, right? I just don't want to conflate all of this with the normal, I have a batch job and want to report finish of the batch job to the push gateway. I think that's just a different and fundamentally very simple use case that we don't have to mix up with the very powerful and potentially a bit hairy aggregation collector thing.
Would that aggregation collector thing as its own TSDB and queries, and would it be a Prometheus server?
No, I think it's exporter. That's what we want, no?
It's essentially StatsD exporter, just without the problems of the StatsD protocol. And I don't feel qualified to solve those problems, but I'm fairly sure there are people in our community or somewhere in the universe who are fairly qualified thinking about this problem, or who might have already solved it. We just aren't aware of. I haven't even studied how the Weaveworks push aggregator is doing it, if they are doing anything about it.
Okay, just to catch up, so to rephrase you, Bjorn, you're saying that bad jobs case should be actually solved by the push gateway. Why it's so different than the serverless?
This very narrow use case the push gateway was meant for, right? And then now people shoehorn it into other use cases, which means they have those use cases. But I think we should not support the shoehorning. We should just create a proper solution for those use cases.
I still don't get why bad job is narrow thing of serverless. Like what exactly you can simplify, serverless, like long ongoing, let's say, functions that you need to, I don't know, use push for some reason. Those are just bad jobs. So I don't get what's the difference.
I mean, okay, batch job just is not complete to describe the push gateway use case, because batch jobs often have a similar thing where they want an aggregated count, right? The push gateway is for kind of self-system. I mean, the classical example is I run a database backup and I want to report when I'm done, so that on the push gateway I can see if the last backup is too long ago, right? But also if I miss that, I don't lose any data. I just might get a spurious alert, right? That's where this is simple, where push gateway can get away with not having a proper persistent solution, not having any HA story, all those things, right?
Cool.
It's also a bad job if I just want to add up all the processed records, right? But that's not what the push gateway probably supports right now. That would be where I want to add up stuff in a distributed fashion.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so this seems like a good discussion. I wonder if we can navigate to the API part. So let's say we have statsd exporter, kind of like that, and we have contributors who are very willing to, I don't know, use maybe with aggregation proxy as a starting point, but let's say add it to the Prometheus org or like Prometheus community. What should be the front API for that? Should we actually switch to open metric push maybe? And deprecate the push gateway API? Should we, and we do that for the push gateway as well? Should we rename? Looks like we don't want to keep just remote write for the protobuf reasoning, right? So that's, I think, consensus. But still, we have open metrics and push gateway API being similar, I think.
It also depends. I mean, there's the format of how to transfer the metrics, but there's also like technical concerns, which, I mean, as I said, I don't feel qualified, but I could imagine you want to also push a UUID to prevent double counts, right? And perhaps you want to transfer a sequence number if this is not different jobs, but the same, and they can actually give you an idea if they have pushed something before. I don't know, like this is all very vague, but I think there could be parts in the protocol that avoid the problems of statsd with double counting and loss of counts. But I'm not sure. Like this is where I would like to listen to someone who has already experienced like how to do push properly, essentially, because that's a hard problem. I mean, not only push, but aggregation. Like I count push events essentially, and I don't want to overcount and undercount too much.
There is another push API involved, OTLP metrics, right? I don't know what's the latest. Is it GA or not? But
yes, it is.
I think we're currently having the problem that we have way too many balls in the air. So let's try and do partial consensus to remove axes from the whole discussion space. The simplest one is if we want to find a new name for the concept of something which does caching. So either I think caching exporter or cacher might be an appropriate name.
Aggregation. I like aggregation part because it's.
But aggregation is detached from being a caching thing. Of course, an aggregation can also happen through scrapes, whereas caching implies I retain this information, which is not live. Like that's one of the fundamental differences towards a normal exporter, that you don't have live data. It might be data which is half an hour old, and I think that is one of the common misunderstandings with push gateway and such, and with MQTT exporter, because it is not an exporter. It is something which caches and offers this. But also, I don't want to derail the whole discussion. I'm just trying to see if we can find consensus on just finding a name for that concept. So going forward, we have a name.
I don't think so. I don't think we want a name before we actually know the solution.
Yeah, maybe let's postpone this. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but can we find a working name so at least we don't get confused ourselves? Because I do feel that. Okay, so can we just call it cacher? Is that a good name? No, it's not. Okay. Suggestions?
I mean, we also so this is for the non-aggregating thing.
It might be aggregating, but that is not the defining property. The defining property it gets stuffed. It caches things which are pushed to it through whatever mechanism, and then offers it to Prometheus either through remote write or scraping.
Well, probably the better name would be working with push gateway next generation.
The real push gateway. Let's call it the real push gateway.
Yes.
I mean, I know that we are 15 minutes over the full hour, so maybe we need a break.
Yeah. Just for history,
Yes.
some people also called the push gateway a cache, which we didn't want to use as a name back then because we didn't want the timeout for metrics, which is all another thing where people suggest a cache is something where the metric can time out, right? And we always rejected that. And there might also be legitimate use cases for that one. They are just not push gateway use cases. So yeah, perhaps there are, as you say, there are too many different use cases in the air, which we need to analyze more carefully.
Yeah, what about just naming it push API convention, right? Like we work on the push API. Isn't that explicit?
I don't think so, of course. It's not talking about the concept. At least in my mind, we are constructing different use cases out of a set of relatively few atomic use cases. And my intention here is to nail down the atomic use cases so we can discuss them in isolation, as opposed to always coming back to, like, when we discuss serverless, we have a whole bunch of different atomic use cases which is being combined into a new use case. And that is where we get into the cyclic confusion of discussion, at least in my opinion. Buffer, just as a working title, and we don't find consensus. We just use it as a word for the concept of something which gets pushed to it, or pushy make push face.
Or push exporter.
Caching exporter would also work, but it doesn't matter. So anyone make a suggestion and we take it. Else it will be called pushy McPush face.
But this is for something that also should do like distributed counting, essentially.
No, this is already a higher level use case. This is not the atomic use case. The atomic use case is something pushes to a thing, and that thing can present as either a thing to be scraped, like /metrics or whatever, or it can use Prometheus remote write.
So it's a push exporter.
Yeah, push exporter, let's do it.
Okay, so we would, for example, be calling the push gateway, we would be calling it, for example, Open Metrics push exporter. We would rename, or we would suggest to the MQTT people that they rename it to MQTT push exporter.
No, this is a working name. You just asked that it is a working name.
Okay. Working name, push exporter. So we have that one use case down. Should we have a break or not? I'm fine either way.
Should we do the call for consensus first?
For as written, that's way too complex. I think we are not near that thing. I mean, we can have an info thing. Okay, as an info, push exporter is the working title for the atomic concept of something that gets Open Metrics, MQTT, Open TLP, etc. pushed at it and presents it as /metrics and or sends through Prometheus remote write. Deliberately not as a consensus, but now we have a name for that thing. For aggregation, maybe Robert has input. Mr. Frotto.
He said no in the chat.
Oh. Okay. He should. He has good thoughts, but okay.
He said also sorry
for having good thoughts. Okay. I think we will. I think at least for. Oh. I'm half sneezing, sorry. I think we will end up with a concept of aggregation, because we already have it in the push gateway as of today. We are already able to aggregate different things pushing at the push gateway and then presenting onwards.
Do we?
No.
No, we don't.
The push gateway refuses to be an aggregation, or even aggregator.
I thought I was able to push into different namespaces.
Yeah, but it doesn't aggregate.
It does not aggregate.
Okay.
And also, like, I mean, what's written right now in the info is kind of push gateway, right? Just that push gateway just receives old Prometheus format for now.
Yes, but that's intended that this new name also covers the at least underlying atomic use case of the push gateway. So we have something which is hopefully maybe less confusing tomorrow.
I just think that enumerating the different use cases would actually help clean up the confusion, because I think a lot of the confusion is that we have about 2 to 5 different use cases conflated, and I'm not saying that there could be a binary that caters for all those use cases, but I think it's still valuable to describe them all cleanly separated and then have an informed decision if the same mechanism should cater for all of them or if it should be different binaries. And like even with the push gateway, you see all those problems with it, that there are different semantics even for this. You push a metric and present it via metrics, like, yeah. For example, do I want it to time out or not? That's already different.
But just ignoring those problems and not actually, not doing anything is also hard. So that's why we should have like focus project for that.
Yeah, but I'm just saying we should actually not expect the problem to become simpler by conflating them all into the same from the beginning. I think we should actually define clearly what the different use cases are, and then what the ideal solution for each of them is, and then have an informed decision if we create like 2 or 3 different solutions for it, or one solution that happens to solve them all.
Yeah, I agree.
But that points to a design doc, because I think that explodes the context, the scope of this call. I mean, we can try and hammer out the first few initial use cases, but I think that's firmly in design document territory.
Yeah, totally. But like even the consensus of this push exporter is the working title of the, I have no idea if atomic concept, but something that gets, but it doesn't block if it's like one thing, 1 binary or 10 binaries. Like I don't think this is really strict naming here. I don't know, like it's really just the incentive that we want to kind of approach it, right? And to be honest, I don't want to be devil's advocate, but I'm pretty sure we need to have a consensus why we cannot leave that to open telemetry collector. We should have like an open message statement. Why not? Because I have like in Red Hat as well these discussions why we cannot just use open telemetry collector, right? And the one statement is that, well, there is no push API which is compatible with Prometheus instrumentation, right? And I think, but we might want to add that to the open telemetry collector if that solves. Sure, it will be not optimized. It will be not easy to, I don't know, use for users and so on. So I think this is the message we want to show, but let's make it public.
Frederick is not in the call anymore. We had similar discussions some time ago, in particular in the context of Kubernetes, where with cube state metrics and such, they need to have the highest performance path which they can possibly get. And the clear intention from SIG instrumentation was to not diverge from this high performance path. Of course, they have something which works, and they don't intend to make it more complex and or slower. Of course, they have a defined interface which they want to have. Along the same lines, I do think that having this highly optimized path which ignores all the extensibility on purpose is a good thing in and as of itself. In particular, of course, it's largely based on code which has been stable and proven at scale for years now. If/when OpenTelemetry is as a point where they have the full performance and reliability and resilience and everything and can act as a drop-in replacement, I actually think it would make sense to talk about just dropping what we have and using it and using the OpenTelemetry stuff instead. It's currently not in a state where we could consider doing this. But if that is the case, sometime in the future, it's absolutely something which we should be considering. But like, it seems very premature. In particular, given that Kubernetes is the thing within CNCF and the cloud native space, aligning with the intention of how Kubernetes intends to be used and intends to be observed, seems borderline obvious.
I agree, Richie. I think let's mention that. Yeah.
But that's also detached from the thing which we were discussing. So should we find a consensus on creating a design document to basically rethink/improve push/serverless/MQTT/IoT use cases?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we will.
The design doc is titled "Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Pushing, but You Were Afraid to Ask."
If you volunteer to write it, you can name it as such.
I would love to volunteer it, but I just have way too many things I would like to write in my limited lifespan.
We can write a book and sell it. This is so large topic. Yeah.
Consensus. We will create a design document to improve the pushing /serverless/MQTT/IoT use cases in the Prometheus ecosystem, or to directly address. Okay, sorry, once more. Consensus. We will create a design document to directly address serverless/MQTT/IoT use cases in the Prometheus ecosystem. All agreed? Anyone disagreeing?
Sure, I agree.
Is that an agreement, Ben?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, still around the APIs, looks like we're leaving this in the kind of, so far as I say it, like push gateway API is really strict to the simply narrow use case of usage of the push gateway. The Open Metrics API, Open Metric push, we leave it as something that kind of exists, but only in dreams. And remote write is replication only.
Do you want to block the push gateway to also accept Open Metrics if the content type of the push metric is Open Metrics?
No, I don't want to. Question is, do we want to do that?
I would not close the door because Open Metrics has some advantages. Like, for example, the EOF at the end of the metrics is something that would be useful for the push gateway.
So maybe do you want to have a consensus to add this to the push gateway API? And by the way, it's not only push gateway API, it's also client Golang, right?
I mean, by client Golang, you mean the push feature in it. Yeah. I mean, that every client library has that, right? Or more or less. Most client libraries have it. Which is, I mean, if you strictly speaking, if you push to the push gateway, there's the assumption that everything you ever push to the push gateway is consistent with each other, which is something that remote write doesn't need as a requirement, right? Because remote write just saves it as it comes in, while the push gateway all has to assemble it into a consistent /metrics exposition, which would be different if a push gateway would expose all those things separately, like being multiple push gateways in one. So these are all things. I mean, the current so-called push gateway API is just like super tailored to what the push gateway is doing. Yeah, that's why I think it's probably not a good role model for more generic use cases.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is a different use case, right? Here is the current value of a counter. Please remember it for me. It's just a different use case than add free to whatever we had before.
Which is different from, here is what I would expose via /metrics, but I can't, so please expose it for me.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is what many people use the push gateway for, and then they run into issues.
Okay, looks like this requires design doc, and different use cases requires maybe different semantics API. So, okay, that's a cool statement as well.
And just as a note on the, this is distributed counters. I honestly believe for many monitoring use cases, people are fine with fuzzy distributed counteriness because they've been using, a lot of people have been using the stats exporter for a long time, and they seem to be okay with that. And yeah, sometimes things get double counted or under counted, but yeah, cool. That's all I wanted to say. Break? Do we have another topic?
We have plenty. I was just waiting if people are continuing to discuss. I wasn't paying attention for the last 2 or 3 minutes because I was cleaning up the.
I mean, we have 27 minutes left. Berthy, rush. That's the wrong word. Berthy, just do it without a break, because if we now take a 8-minute break, we have only 20 minutes left.
Yes, I agree.
Depends on you all.
We can go on for me.
I think I had something with 5 votes, but I can't find it. No, that's. I'm looking for something which can be quick. Package directory might be quick. The other thing which might also be super quick is to move remote write out of the experimental area, as we already have pretty much done and dried. Let's just try this for something quick. Julian, you have the floor. Or maybe I just summarize. The proposal by Julian was to move Prometheus remote write out of experimental. And I think as we already have the spec written, we can just have consensus that, I mean, maybe we can also just move it to stale, to be honest. It's probably.
I'm super not familiar with remote write. Does it have any kind of versioning so that we can do a V2, or is this something that's, I think, one thing that we should leave open is how do we radically change it in the future?
There is a specification, and that is, I think it hasn't seen the final stamp of approval, but once that's the case, it will be 1.0, and then it has its versioning. So it's a little bit cyclic, but
what I mean
we
is
send a version header.
Okay.
Like we send a version header on every request that says, I think it's like 001 or 010 right now, whatever it is. We can change that.
Awesome.
The question is like, how will the coming feature affect this? Like the transactions, that kind of things is still being worked on by Arkishan. So I'm wondering, like, if that could still have an impact before we go 1.0, and if that should be part of 1.0, that stuff is transactional.
I think that we have had this for so long that we cannot make substantial changes to it without bumping the version number. As such, I consider it stable already, and it's just a case of documenting what we do.
Yeah, I agree with Richie here. Like whatever work Harkishan, and I think he was on this call. Is he still here?
It's very late for him, so I guess he dropped.
He might have dropped. Yeah, like the work he does will have to be in the framework of it will not break current consumers of remote write. So I consider it stable as is.
So let's do the quick thing. Consensus, we will. I mean, that's the implicit consensus already anyway,
but we should make it explicit. Like, I mean, I agree that we can't realistically change it anymore, so we may as well make it official.
Yeah.
And we can change it by incrementing the version number and dealing with all of that when we need to, which we would already have to do now, because we would be breaking the world if we were to change it without changing the version number.
There's actually one subtopic. Should we officially bless the name PRW instead of Prometheus Remote Write? Because it's a super long name. But we don't use it. It's something which OpenTelemetry came up with, and it's a lot easier to write than Prometheus Remote Write. I would suggest we just adopt it similar how we write OM and just use it as open metrics. Lots of thinky faces. Okay, so let's just move on. Consensus. We will release what we do today as 1.0 and build on top of it once 1.0 is stable. Good.
What's the implication of once 1.0 is stable? Like what does
things which are not in today can then be added or changed, because we have a version which users which rely on the current behavior can rely on not going away. Of course, it is a standard, and at least for Prometheus 2.x, we will obviously commit to retaining it and not breaking it. Of course, it is stable.
I have one concern. I think that some people are currently, and I think it's Levi, working on reconciliating the exemplars and the remote write into one protobuf. I wonder how that will affect, if we say it's stable now, how it will affect that. So do we also mark the exemplars in remote write stable?
That is, well, metadata is specifically called out as experimental within, like at another level than our remote write guarantee being stable. So like this would be, yes, it is doubly experimental. So this would be overall stable, but I think like metadata and when exemplars are in there, things like that, those are still explicitly said to be experimental.
Because I think the remote write specification was written before we had exemplar, so we might. Oh no, so it's already there, but we should just check that we don't call that very stable if we plan to still move around.
Yeah. When we review the changes for this, let's make sure that metadata and exemplars are specifically excluded.
Should we add this to the consensus or just to the meeting notes?
Just meeting notes is fine by me.
Yes.
I hear Chris is volunteering for writing this while I search for the next topic.
Yeah.
Björn, scalar static arithmetic for timestamps and durations, or is this too long? It's probably too long.
Thinking. Which one was that? I'm still looking.
Scalar static arithmetic for timestamps and durations. I think that's too long.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly what we already alluded to in the, that's kind of step 2 of, I tried to break this into separate things, right?
The question, it has 4 votes. Should I bump this or should I choose something else?
Choose something else.
Okay. This is marked green.
What about discussing proposal process?
Proposal process?
Yes.
That's not on the... there. It has 2 votes. I mean, I don't object. I don't care.
It should be quick.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, we need a proposal process to discuss your proposal to install a proposal process.
Yes, I agree.
I'll just move it over.
Julian, can you add this to your table? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, sorry for like doubling this. I probably was not aware of like previous conversation we had. So, so the kind of the reason why I added this topic again is because we were as a team trying to streamline the different processes. We even created like open handbook, similar to GitLab, what GitLab was used to having. So we have like even a small website. We'll be adding more to kind of team processes which are very open from Red Hat monitoring kind of teams. Anyway, this part of this is like a proposal process, which you can see in the mini, and like it's really following the same proposal process as Kubernetes have, as Thanos have. And the principles of that is that you really write everything as a code, even proposal ideas. And so you add a Markdown file, which has a consistent template that everyone expects. So even if someone is new to even proposal writing, they know what fields to add. We do the pull request. We know which things are in progress because pull request was not merged, either as a rejected or approved. The reason why we merge rejected things instead of just rejecting PR is because it's so easy then to follow up why such a decision was rejected for the time being. And then it's easy to maybe modify it and accept if new idea came or new information came to that, right? And why it's important, especially in Prometheus, is that I believe all those Google Docs lying around, they are super hard to discover. And I think the initiative that you pointed out with this documentation page, Julian, is very good. But who will maintain that? Like things in Google changes, they change links, and it's so easy to modify this Google Docs. So it's never finished, right? You can always add stuff. Someone can suggest stuff. It's not versioned in such strict way as PR. So that's why I would propose to stick to Markdown file, maybe in the docs project, because I think Björn has a good point that it is not strictly to the one Prometheus repository. It should be maybe formulated in a website. So what do you think about that?
What is the threshold for like requiring a proposal?
So requiring proposal, that's a good question. So let's define that. Even in this kind of small pull request, there is some flowchart that talks about this stuff, and I think even information. So what we gathered with previous like Thanos proposal and team proposal is this kind of idea of asking yourself a few questions. Literally, is the idea hard to explain in 10 minutes? Are there many major unknowns? Would the project benefit from documenting the rationales? And does it touch key elements like API? Those for me was, but we can negotiate what, if those are okay criteria or not.
I have one concern that I would not want that to be on the documentation website. I have the case of Kafka when I look for some information about Kafka and then I stumble upon a proposal directly and I think that's a documentation, but maybe the proposal is rejected or it does not match the reality. So this should, I think, not really belong in the documentation because it might confuse users if the proposal is not yet implemented or if it's implemented differently. So we could even have a dedicated repository with just Markdown files for this, but I would not mix that with the documentation.
That was my point. I think, Bjorn, you had different opinion.
The point of Bjorn was that it is not a Prometheus server specific thing, so it should not be in the Prometheus server.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly about Markdown versus Google Docs. Often Google Docs seem like better for collaboratively editing something, but in the end, once the discussion gets more complex, you have those endless threads on the margin of the page, which, I don't know, perhaps it would be better in a pull request. So
I proposed Markdown proposals for Loki at some point, and we tried it for a bit, but we found that discussions on GitHub, especially for proposals, was much harder to have than on Google Docs. I think I agree, like the discoverability is hard, but I think that could be served by some kind of index in Markdown instead.
Who will maintain this index?
I mean, we started maintaining it, and Julian, Bjorn, and myself have created. I mean, they have created it. I have merged it, but like, I do think that we all agree that there is an issue with discoverability. I agree with what Robert said 100%, and wanted to say the same in several different contexts. I have tried several different ways of tracking information and discussion. And the thing which is least bad in my experience is Google Docs, for better or for worse. Once documents get a certain state of stableness, I do think it would make sense, for example, to copy it over and deprecate commenting on the thing, make it read-only, to actively prevent any changes to the thing still happening. And put a marker at the top and say, hey, please look into this Markdown file and such. That's something which I think is good. And for example, for Open Metrics and Prometheus Remote Write and such, once the thing is stable, it becomes Markdown anyway, because that is a lot easier to retain long term. That's one of the aspects. The other aspect is processes are super quick to introduce, and processes are, in the moment, often feel good to introduce, but the inherent risk of processes is you almost never undo or change processes unless you have substantial momentum and substantial pain. You lose significant agility if you have a fixed process. And I would argue that we follow large parts of what is written in what I read in those few minutes already. And if we have details on how to improve it, and I mean, this call is proof that we have improved lots of things, and like with the index for design documents and such. But having something which is mandated, in particular, if I have more than one single A4 page of printed out paper for the process to even make a proposal. If I want to propose something to Prometheus team and I see that thing, I'm closing the tab and doing something else, because it's way too complicated, and the threshold and barrier to entry is way too high for me to follow all of that stuff. Or people don't follow it, and we have a process in name only. Based on experience, I would strongly recommend against adopting a process just so without massive consideration and trial period. Because we will, in my experience, not be undoing this process if we accept it. We will not be changing it a lot.
That also matches my experience with the Kubernetes kept process. Basically, once that was mandated, we stopped contributing to Kubernetes because we don't have the time to go through that. And the worst thing in that was we had a reasonable PR open where core Kubernetes people had already said, yeah, this is reasonable. We just need to get it into shape. It was stuck in an endless review rebase loop. And then it was like, oh no, we need a cap for this now because process. And at that point, we just closed the PR because that's never as not full-time Kubernetes people working on Kubernetes full-time, we can't. And I would like to avoid that for Prometheus. And I don't think Prometheus as a project is big enough to make that necessary. So I'm totally on board with streamlining or better organizing the design documents that we do where we do them now. But I would like to grant, where we already have something on the way, I would like to not go back and require a design document after the fact. And I would like to keep it as optional as possible.
Right. So maybe just a few points. I have strong opinion to make sure there is a Markdown process at the end of the discussion. I would be happy to propose, for example, hey, you can use whatever documentation process you want, but if you want something get approved and have final consensus, well, it has to be on the Markdown and has to be proposed to this PR, to this place with this PR for documentation and tracking capabilities. And I have strong opinion because it worked for Thanos so well. It just so many good feedback that people could actually follow past decision, could implement something which was nicely available in Thanos website. We hold those in Thanos website. It was enormous help, right? And I think it's very orthogonal to the criteria of when we expect this proposal to be done. And hey, you created already the PR, already team understand that. It should be no point in creating the special proposal. And I think that we could make this orthogonal thing, but maybe we can have consensus to at least snapshot and have the consensus on the proposal by merging this PR in the Markdown style, right?
That atomic part makes sense, but what is, for example, if it makes sense in the general case, but if you mandate this as a process, what happens if you have an exploratory design doc where you deliberately implement two different approaches, or you have that one thing which you're playing around with? You're losing that feedback loop because you need, all of a sudden you need to either specify all those things, or you leave it super hand wavy and undefined, because else you're self-constricting too much. That's something which arguably we had in past dev summits, that we had consensuses which are too restrictive, and we had to actually follow the complete process. We had to wait for the next dev summit. We had to discuss it. We had to have a new call for consensus to change the thing where we already had more or less informal consensus. At least that's what it often felt like. But we had to go through the complete shebang. Of course, there was a process, and we had to follow that process.
So
just to finish that point. I think it makes sense to merge if it's stable or stale. I don't think it makes sense to mandate to merge it once you're working on it. Because it can still be a living document which you're changing as you're updating, as you're finding new data, whatever.
So what I do not understand is that Bartek is concerned that we maintain a list of Google Docs, but then he wants to maintain moving Google Docs into Markdown when they are done. And that's a lot more work than maintaining a list of Google Docs.
Yeah, I don't want to maintain any list of Google Docs. What I care is the documentation snapshotted in Markdown. Everything else, let's float the discussion like we have discussions over PRs, over issues, over mailing list. Why you want to track that? When you want to track, move it to Markdown.
So the question is, when do you want to track it? I think that is maybe the question we are actually discussing. In my opinion is we track it like we permanently track it when it is stable or when it is stale.
Yeah, I agree.
Small things which we can do, for example, currently we are writing our meeting notes in Google Docs format. Speaking with my Grafana hat on for blog posts, we also use Google Docs because that's just how collaboration is quickest. But we write in Markdown syntax into Google Docs, at least most of us do, I think. And then we just copy it over into Git or into a Markdown file and make the PR, blah, 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 blah. So that's, for example, one of the things which we can play with, that we try and write design documents and such in Markdown syntax in a Google Doc, which makes it easier to snapshot. We can also, in this overview, for example, have a new section where we say moved to Git, and then we just move that thing over once we have marked it as not to be edited anymore. These kinds of things we can just play with without the overhead of a process which we would need to undo or formally change.
Sure. I would still, for example, my personal proposal, I would always do them in Markdown if there is such process. So I would not restrict any form of proposal. I would restrict the approval process, right? Well, because there has to be process, because how we'll tell people how to approve something, how to make consensus on some idea. And I'm talking about specific cases where with Ganesh, we did this post-processing proposal. It was kind of approved, kind of not. And at the end, it was totally rejected because we have some further ideas. It was evolving, but it would be nice to evolve it in the iterations. And in marked iterations, it was so confusing for everyone. And literally, it was failing. It was really bad mentorship experience as well because of that.
I mean, what I'm hearing is what we want is that in the end, it's like the end product is Markdown, and the final discussion and approval happens around a PR that brings in that Markdown. How the text gets to be there in the first place, I think we can leave that totally open. And it might be that someone comes around and says, I have a fully fledged, like fully written proposal. Here is my PR, and let's discuss this. That may have come from a Google Doc or not. That may have come from like beautiful handwriting. It may be like people can also open work in progress PRs and say, I want to work on this now, and then start pushing into that. I don't think we need to restrict that, at least not right now.
My concern is that we will have the same discussions twice, once in the Google Doc comments and one in the Markdown comments.
Well, I will tell you why, because in Google Docs, if you add a comment and you just approve it, you have thousands of the same discussions because you just approve the comment versus in PR, it's much more discoverable, right? That's my point.
More discoverable for you personally.
I don't think anyone go through the past comments on Google Doc.
I mean, I don't always go through the past comments on GitHub either. So.
True. But then you can link at least to those and stuff like that. Yeah, I think maybe it's opinionated, maybe. Yeah. I think I would not restrict discussion process. I would restrict approval process. Yeah.
But now you're actually making good arguments against the process, because if we do not have a process, no one is stopping you from having your design document in Markdown, living in a PR or in your own repository or somewhere else, and writing it and maintaining it in whatever form you choose. And also it gives us the ability to try yet again, of course, as a reminder, we used to do this, to trial discussions in PRs.
I also know that we already have, it's not a list of Google Docs, it's a list of design doc, and there is one in Markdown in the Alert Manager repository.
Yeah. But I mean, Bartek, no one is stopping you from doing it as such. I honestly think you will get less feedback and less quickly and less detailed and less specific, but we can just try it. I mean, if memory serves correctly, Björn, correct me if I'm wrong, we used to do this in the early days, in I don't know when.
Yeah, it's still linked. The one for the securing the traffic in Alert Manager lives in the Alert Manager repository in Markdown.
That's by far not the only one. We had several ones. I do remember that we had the 2.0 or 2.x storage discussion and such also all in GitHub, and it was super confusing. And that is what actually led us to adopting the Google Docs approach, if I remember correctly. Again, Björn, correct me if I'm wrong.
The 2.x storage discussion was in a secret design doc that Fabian only shared with Brian.
I mean the one on GitHub, but
the one on GitHub.
Or Matthias, you can also correct me. Sorry for.
I have no idea actually.
Okay. If memory serves correctly, we had precisely this problem, and that's precisely why we changed to Google Docs to have more dynamic discussions. Just as a point of order, we are at time. We can also, like, if everyone wants to continue, we can also continue. I'm fine either way.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't remember any conscious decision to do design docs in Google Doc because the discussion on pull requests in Markdown was too complicated.
I would propose that we don't introduce a policy at this time because we are not sure enough what that policy exactly should be. I propose that, especially for discussions that Bartek leads, we try having the discussions in different places. We are not limited to using Google Docs by any policy either. And then with that additional experience, like we're talking a lot about what we used to do and trying to remember what it used to be like, but let's try what it is like now. Also, GitHub has evolved, right? GitHub has a lot more help in discussing something around a PR now. Maybe this turns out great and everybody loves it and nobody wants to make Google Docs anymore. Maybe we find some intermediate phase. Yeah.
Totally.
Playing devil's advocate, there were more changes to GitHub and how to interface with information stored in GitHub than there was any change to the URLs of Google Docs. So,
but now all the Google Docs URLs are changing. They just sent an email today that they're breaking all the share links.
Yes, ish. They don't actually tell you what they are doing. They just send you a super fishy email that you must read this and click here. But
anyway, so looks like there is this proposal of just trying things out and not making any policy, but doesn't mean that we can try to create the proposal repo for experimentation purposes.
I think that's fine. Yeah.
All right.
I think we don't need a consensus for this because Bartek can just create it and it's done.
I think we generally want to do consensus if we start new things in the Prometheus org. But one thing I would ask is that we make it clear just in the README for that repository that this is not an exhaustive list of all proposals. The exhaustive list is the documentation page that we have that links all the. Yeah.
Okay.
Just so that people don't get confused and think, oh, but why isn't it not here? Until we make it, or we move the list that we have into that repository.
Why don't we just make this part of the docs repository?
Because of the confusion between what is design and what is documentation. And I think that confusion has two parts. One is you find something, but it's not actually exactly as the implementation is now. Or the other side, which I also find extremely annoying sometimes, where the only documentation for a thing is the design document, and then you're left on your own to figure out, like, okay, how was this actually implemented? Like, how do I configure it now? And both the temptation to keep it at that will be too strong if it's on the docs website. So I would prefer to at least not right now.
The counterpoint is that moving stuff around after you designate something stable or so is also super annoying. And with tagging of the PRs and the discussions, we can easily discern between what is what. But this is not a super strong opinion.
Yeah, but this is about in docs or not in docs.
Yes, and my point is, I think we can easily make this work as part of docs, so we don't have proliferation of more repositories, and we just git move stuff from /proposal to /accepted, and we retain full git history and everything.
I am on Matthias' side, where I try to configure Kafka mirroring, and the only documentation available is a design doc, which I needed to reverse engineer the stuff to make it work, and that's very annoying.
My view is it's about Googleability, and I would like to not have design documents appear on Prometheus.io. That's the main point for me, because for us it's easy. Oh, we know what the tags are and what exactly this means. But when I come in from the outside and I how do I join in Prometheus, and I find and I click a thing that says implementing joins in Prometheus, right? And I click it and I read it and it all makes sense, and then I try to do it, and then I go back and I realize it's under /rejected, right? And I have to look at the URL, and Chrome is in a phase of hiding the URL again, so I don't actually see that.
One point of order: we are under quorum, solidly now. What Bartek wrote would be my suggestion. We can just have a subdirectory which is not make part of Prometheus.io and done. But I also think it's a little bit bike shady. I mean, Bartek wants to do this, so Bartek should just decide what he wants to do and how he wants to try it. And if he needs approval by team to create a new repository, just send email and tweet +1 and then done.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Good. Then, thank you very much. See you at the latest in a month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
I can't promise yet what I'm gonna how available I'm gonna be in the next 3 months, because I'm on sabbatical.
That's a good point. If we have too many people going on vacation, we can reschedule or skip.
Yeah. I'm just informatively, I'm taking a sabbatical. So
nice.
Enjoy.
Yeah, I'm envious. That's also part of the recording.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm envious, but nice.
Bye. Bye-bye.
See you.
Yeah.